we, in my view, have a responsibility not to escalate the rhetoric of this and not to escalate the tensions in this. Our job is to try and reinforce the international unity, the determination of NATO and the Western world to stand up and confront and condemn Russia's aggression.
The Foreign Secretary's warning Moscow might be using peace talks with Ukraine as a smokescreen in order to regroup troops for further attacks. Speaking to The Times, Liz Truss says it's up to President Vladimir Zelensky to decide how his country approaches discussions with the Kremlin. Let's speak now to the Shadow Defence Secretary, Labour's John Healey. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Is Liz Truss's assessment right, do you think?
Yes. You'd expect Putin to be pursuing diplomatic talks. How serious he becomes about those remains to be seen. You'd expect him to be trying to recover some of the failures of his military machine. He's clearly miscalculated on the strength of his own forces and badly miscalculated on the strength of the Ukrainian resistance that he now faces.
So what needs to happen then? If these talks are not working, what needs to happen to bring peace to Ukraine?
Maximum pressure on Putin and on Russia. So the unified international sanctions are important. The increasing international isolation of Putin and Russia is important. The International Criminal Court's investigation into war crimes to bring justice is important. And what's above all important is that we continue to support the Ukrainian military resistance with any of the help that we can provide. And the UK has played an important role in this, and Labour has given the UK government its full support during this process. I met with 4 Ukrainian MPs who were visiting London this week, and they described the UK's military assistance as a superpower to Ukraine. So that's why the government's had our full support to keep doing this. And we've got to make sure those supplies keep flowing into the hands of the Ukrainian resistance.
I note that you're not talking in any terms of any kind of military intervention at all. And what are the red lines? What are Labour's red lines that would justify military intervention in Ukraine? Would you be prepared to use military force if there were chemical weapons deployed?
I'm not talking about UK intervention in Ukraine, and nor is NATO. There's a clear decision not to do that because of the risk of the severe escalation. If NATO and Russia start fighting face to face, that would lead to huge escalation of the conflict in Ukraine and an escalation more widely across Europe. So that's the reason.
So there are no circumstances in which British troops would be fighting in Ukraine?
There are some very important international laws and UN conventions that Russia has already breached. We know they're capable of going even further because we've seen them do so in other conflicts, like in Chechnya and in Syria. But as a politician leading for Labour on defence and as government ministers, we, in my view, have a responsibility not to escalate the rhetoric of this and not to escalate the tensions in this. Our job is to try and reinforce the international unity, the determination of NATO and the Western world to stand up and confront and condemn Russia's aggression and to support Ukraine in whatever way we can with the fight that they have on their hands. And I was really pleased this week that finally, after pressing for a couple of weeks, the government was able to confirm that our UK Starstreak missiles are now being delivered into the Ukrainian forces. These are air defense missiles with a range of about 7 kilometers. So it is starting to allow in local areas the Ukrainians to put up some of their own no-fly zone and air defense systems for themselves.
Given this new world in which we have found ourselves, some would say it has always been the world in which we're living in, but we just didn't view it in the right way. Should we be spending more on defence? And if so, how should that be paid for?
Well, we've seen this month Germany double its defence spending this year, and yet in Britain we're still cutting the number of troops, the number of tanks, the number of planes, the number of ships over the next 3 years. And any government must respond to new threats as we face from this invasion to the UK and European security, just as Labour in government did after the 9/11 terror attacks, when we introduced then the largest sustained increase in defence spending for 2 decades. So we have to review defence spending. And if the government is ready to boost defence as it needs, then it will continue to have Labour's full support.
How should it be paid for?
What it should be paid for, in the same way as the government funds any of its spending. And the detailed call about the numbers is one that only the government can make with access to the figures. But the principle that the first duty of government is to defend the country, keep its citizens safe, play our part in our NATO alliance means that with these new threats, they must review defence spending. And if they boost defence, just as Labour did after the terrorist attacks on the Twin Towers in New York, then they will have our support.
But surely, I mean, you can't just leave it to the government who have access to the figures, as you say. Do you think that increasing defence spending is important enough to put up taxes for example?
Well, let's see what the Chancellor does in the spring statement this week. The first priority has got to get the economic fundamentals right. And this is a British economy which has recovered more slowly from COVID than many countries like France and the US and Canada. We're bottom of the league for the growth predictions for next year. And we've got inflation already at 5.5% and set to rise higher. People are feeling the cost of living pressure, the increase in prices, with further rises on energy bills to come, which the government could do more to help with. And above all, people are going to be faced from April with a tax rise on national insurance, which is going to make life so much more difficult for all. And that's one step that we're urging the government, as we have from the start, to pull back from, postpone and rethink.
Do you think Vladimir Putin's a war criminal?
Yes. There is quite clearly war crimes being committed at present. He has breached international law. He's violated United Nations conventions by invading and killing people in Ukraine. But he's committing war crimes because he is systematically, ruthlessly, mercilessly targeting civilians. And we should expect, I'm afraid to say, an escalation of that violence as Putin comes under more pressure. And this brings us back to the imperative of a ceasefire and serious negotiations. And that will depend on the strength of the Ukrainian resistance and their continuing fight, which we must support, and the strength of the international sanctions and pressure on Russia to respond and come to the table.
Finally, John Healey, I couldn't let you go without asking you about P&O and those 800 people who have been made were made redundant over video link the day before yesterday. The Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, says P&O should be nationalised. Do you agree?
I'd like to see the government take more immediate steps than that sort of thing. It's certainly shocked even to Conservative ministers that have been quite happy to see employers have a freer hand in dealing with employees in the past. No, what I'd like to see is the government respond immediately, cut P&O's parent company DP World out of any of the advisor groups they currently serve on, advising government ministers. And I'd like to see them suspend the contracts they have in place with the British government. And P&O have had £38 million worth of taxpayers' money over the last 4 years. Those contracts must be suspended.
Shadow Defence Secretary John Healey from Labour, thank you so much.